Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson found herself on a nearly empty stretch of highway just outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was past 11 p.m., a quiet hour when the city usually slipped into silence, the streets nearly deserted except for an occasional car whose headlights shimmered against the wet pavement. Renee had been driving for nearly 2 hours, fingers lightly tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with a gentle jazz melody softly echoing from the car speakers. Dressed casually in a black sweater and jeans, her hair neatly pulled back, she appeared unremarkable, just another tired traveler heading home late at night. She expected no attention, least of all from law enforcement. Suddenly, the calm was interrupted by a sudden burst of red and blue lights flashing vividly in her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened, not from fear, she was too experienced for that, but from sheer exhaustion at facing yet another senseless confrontation. Familiar with protocol from her extensive military career, Renee calmly signaled, smoothly changing lanes, and brought her car to a careful stop on the road's shoulder. Keeping her hands clearly visible on the wheel, she waited patiently for the officer to approach. In the side mirror, she watched as the policeman emerged from the white patrol vehicle parked behind hers, his flashlight beam cutting through the night as he approached deliberately. His badge caught her eye as it flashed under the dim glow of streetlights, Briggs. Without greeting or courtesy, Officer Briggs demanded Renee's license and registration, his tone cold, impatient, almost dismissive. As she handed over the requested documents, Renee politely inquired whether she'd been speeding, receiving no immediate answer. Instead, Briggs accused her of a broken tail light, a claim she instinctively doubted, given recent maintenance checks. When she voiced her mild objection, Briggs immediately bristled, accusing her of argumentativeness. A tense silence stretched between them, thickening with the tension of authority being questioned. Renee recognized the subtle power play unfolding, the familiar game of intimidation she'd encountered many times before, especially as a black woman in uniform and out of it. Despite her calm, respectful demeanor, Briggs escalated the situation abruptly, ordering Renee out of the vehicle without explanation. The night air was unexpectedly cool as Renee stepped out, fully aware of the officer's aggressive posture, his confidence drawn from the emptiness of the road and the silence surrounding them. Renee stood firm but respectful, calmly questioning the reason behind his demands, a question that sparked irritation in Briggs, who immediately labeled her noncompliant. Realizing quickly that logic and calm reasoning wouldn't sway Briggs, Renee made the calculated choice to comply, her training guiding her to avoid further escalation. But beneath her measured exterior, Renee knew this wasn't a routine traffic stop. She understood exactly what was happening. Briggs saw her merely as another black woman, vulnerable to intimidation, unaware that this encounter would become the moment when his unchecked arrogance collided with a force far stronger than he'd imagined. Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson found herself facing an encounter she had seen unfold countless times before, a scenario that started as a routine traffic stop but rapidly devolved into an exercise of raw power and intimidation. Officer Briggs approached Renee's vehicle that quiet night outside Birmingham, Alabama, carrying himself with a sense of unquestioned authority, his footsteps heavy against the wet pavement. From the moment he spoke, it became clear his intent was not to enforce the law, but rather to assert dominance over someone he believed he could easily intimidate, just another black woman alone on a dimly lit highway. Briggs never offered Renee the basic courtesy of an explanation. He provided only blunt commands and dismissive responses. His accusation of a broken tail light, a minor infraction Renee knew wasn't accurate, was a clear pretext designed to escalate the situation. When she respectfully questioned his claims, asserting her rights with calm determination, Briggs immediately reacted with hostility. To him, her confidence was an affront, an unacceptable challenge to his authority. The moment Renee asked for an explanation, Briggs labeled her as non-compliant, framing a simple request for clarity as defiance. This subtle shift in their interaction marked a critical turning point, one Renee recognized from her military training. It was the precise moment power confronted resistance, where Briggs fully expected her to yield. Yet Renee wasn't just another civilian Briggs could easily intimidate. She was a seasoned lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy, trained in combat drills and crisis management. Her decision to calmly assert herself wasn't defiance, it was a conscious exercise of her rights. Still, Briggs chose to interpret her composure as a challenge to his authority. Without justification, he ordered Renee out of the car, swiftly declaring her under arrest for the vague charge of obstructing an officer, a label that conveniently masked his actual motive, punishing her for daring to question his actions. His actions betrayed deeper biases. Renee was not merely facing an arrogant cop, but rather a systemic abuse of power rooted in racial prejudice. Briggs tightened the cuffs deliberately, shoving her roughly into his patrol car, confident that no witnesses were present to challenge his account. His casual cruelty, exemplified by the painfully tight cuffs and smug demeanor, wasn't merely about enforcing the law, it was about asserting dominance, punishing Renee for daring to stand firm. This entire encounter occurred not because Renee had done something wrong, but because Briggs perceived her as vulnerable, a black woman driving alone late at night, someone he could easily intimidate without consequence. Yet Briggs fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Renee's composure masked deep resolve. She knew her rights, understood the dangerous dynamics at play, and refused to become another silent victim of unchecked police authority. Briggs believed he had the power, that the uniform made him untouchable. But he underestimated Renee badly. This stop, intended to humble her, would instead become the moment Briggs's career began its swift descent, all because he chose to exercise power rather than uphold justice. On that dimly lit highway outside Birmingham, Alabama, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson found herself in an all-too-familiar situation, one she recognized immediately from decades of disciplined training in the Navy and experiences shared among countless others who looked like her. Yet Renee's resistance was not about rebellion or defiance, it was about quiet strength, dignity, and the unwavering belief in justice that generations before her had courageously upheld. When Officer Matthews approached Renee's vehicle that evening, wielding his authority like a shield, Renee understood clearly the dynamics at play. With a flashlight glaring harshly in her eyes, he demanded her license and registration without even the minimal courtesy of an explanation. Renee complied smoothly, her motions deliberate, respectful, yet confident. But when Officer Matthews accused her of a broken tail light, a transparent excuse to justify his decision to pull her over, she gently questioned the validity of his claim. Her question wasn't aggressive or confrontational, rather, it was an assertion of her rights, a quiet reminder of dignity and accountability. Renee's calm demeanor visibly unsettled Matthews. He was accustomed to automatic compliance, perhaps especially from women like her, someone he mistakenly assumed would simply shrink into silence when confronted with authority. But Renee wasn't intimidated. Her lifetime in the military had taught her the importance of standing firm, knowing clearly what she was allowed to do and, more importantly, what no authority figure could rightfully demand. When Matthews abruptly ordered her out of the vehicle, she hesitated only to ask, "Mind telling me why?" Her voice was steady, tone neutral, underscoring the question's legitimacy rather than defiance. It was precisely this measured confidence, this quiet assertion of her rights, that irritated Matthews, who expected unquestioning obedience. Matthews attempted intimidation by escalating the confrontation, accusing Renee of obstructing justice simply for daring to ask legitimate questions. Renee sensed the shift in atmosphere immediately, the tension, the unspoken understanding that Matthews expected submission. But Renee had seen power abused before, both overseas and at home. She knew that yielding silently was how injustices perpetuated themselves. Instead of resisting physically, she made the deliberate choice to comply calmly, slowly stepping out onto the cool pavement, her hands visible, movements measured. When Matthews roughly secured her wrists behind her back, tightening the cuffs painfully and unnecessarily, she didn't protest or flinch outwardly. Her training had prepared her to endure discomfort, teaching her that control in moments of tension was essential. Yet Renee's resistance ran deeper than passive compliance. Even as Matthews roughly placed her in the patrol car, confidently believing he'd broken her spirit, Renee maintained quiet resolve. Her strength lay in patience, dignity, and a profound belief in accountability. Later, as Matthews mocked her from the driver's seat, accusing her of arrogance simply because she dared assert her rights, she spoke calmly but firmly, "I don't think, I know exactly who I am." Those words unsettled Matthews deeply, challenging the very foundations of his assumed superiority. Renee's measured defiance pierced through his smug facade, signaling clearly that she would neither be intimidated nor silenced. Renee Dawson's resistance was about more than this isolated incident. It was about refusing to allow unchecked authority to go unchallenged. Her dignified composure, shaped by years of military discipline and personal integrity, represented the quiet courage familiar to older Americans who'd witnessed the civil rights struggles of decades past. It was a reminder that real strength lies not in dominance but in unwavering conviction and calmly asserting one's rights, and in holding those entrusted with authority accountable for every action they take. Surrounded by the impersonal confines of a drab holding area, the detainee observed every detail, recognizing that each procedural step mattered. Officers conducted cursory checks, occasionally glancing in her direction without acknowledging the gravity of her situation. Though physically restricted, her thoughts remained analytical, recalling how authority often misused its power when it believed itself unchallenged. She noted the worn linoleum floors, the fluorescent overhead lights flickering intermittently, and the unspoken tension that settled among those who quietly witnessed the arrest. The booking process proceeded methodically. Her fingerprints were pressed onto inked cards, one digit at a time, followed by a stern camera operator capturing a mugshot. Her personal belongings were collected, labeled, and tucked away as though they were evidence of wrongdoing. Yet nobody offered clarity about the specific charges. Instead, the charge officer provided a generic explanation, insinuating that she had resisted legitimate orders, implying any protest of innocence amounted to further noncompliance. As she was led toward a cramped cell, the mechanical clang of the metal door resonated with finality. Once inside, she inspected the Spartan interior, a narrow bench attached to the wall, a faint odor of disinfectant lingering in the stale air, and an overhead bulb casting harsh shadows. Throughout her time in custody, her priority was to remain calm, recalling training designed to preserve composure in hostile environments. Although no physical threat seemed imminent, the psychological strain was apparent. Each passing minute magnified the sense that she was isolated in a place meant to break spirits. Observing the officers beyond the bars, she wondered how many others had been processed similarly, denied their right to question the legality of their confinement. The fleeting expressions on a few officers' faces suggested possible doubts about the legitimacy of this detention. Still, they followed standard protocol, placing official procedure above all else. Nobody engaged in conversation regarding what had led to this point. Nobody acknowledged that she might be telling the truth about the events on that quiet highway. Despite the discouragement swirling around her, she maintained a steadfast belief in the system's capacity for eventual justice. She reflected on those who had fought before her, people whose names were etched into the broader struggle for civil rights. Their perseverance emboldened her. Though physically trapped behind steel bars, her willpower remained intact, guiding her through each hour until she could articulate her defense. The moment to prove the impropriety of her detention would come. In her mind, the evidence was clear: she had been unjustly arrested, and she intended to ensure that those responsible for this violation would face accountability. After a tense night, the next morning brought a flurry of activity as officials initiated their investigation. The department's Internal Affairs Unit summoned the arresting officer for immediate questioning, while the detainee's legal team worked tirelessly to secure her release on bail. Relatives, fellow service members, and community supporters expressed concern, raising questions about potential misconduct. Within 48 hours, an experienced detective interviewed witnesses who had observed the traffic stop from a distance. Although those onlookers had not captured every detail, their statements added weight to the detainee's account. In parallel, the defense team compiled records verifying the detainee's impeccable military service and local contributions. During preliminary hearings at the Jefferson County Courthouse, they introduced evidence challenging the validity of the arrest. The presiding judge, known for fairness, listened intently, signaling clear doubts regarding the officer's narrative. A defense attorney, speaking firmly but courteously, underscored how the initial explanation given by law enforcement lacked credible proof. By cross-referencing official documents, the attorney highlighted procedural gaps, including discrepancies in the arrest report and unusual omissions in the required documentation. As the case advanced, the district attorney's office underwent its own review. Under mounting pressure, the prosecutorial staff weighed whether to proceed with formal charges. Meanwhile, the Internal Affairs investigation uncovered previous civilian complaints naming the same officer. Though each had been dismissed for lack of conclusive evidence, a pattern emerged that suggested systematic abuse of authority. The department's leadership, concerned about reputational harm, allowed external oversight to ensure neutrality. During the formal evidentiary hearing, defense counsel played body cam footage that contradicted key parts of the officer's statement. The court audience, which included local journalists and city officials, observed with growing skepticism. In the footage, the detainee appeared calm, neither resisting nor threatening. At critical moments, the officer employed language suggesting bias, framing her legitimate questions as aggressive. Once the footage concluded, the courtroom fell silent for several seconds. Even the prosecutor appeared visibly unsettled. Upon closer evaluation of the officer's background, the judge noted that prior incidents had been set aside under questionable circumstances. Confronted by undeniable video evidence, the prosecution conferred with the defense to explore alternatives to an extended trial. Privately, they recognized that the case might collapse, potentially tarnishing the department's standing. Newspapers and broadcast outlets exposed the unfolding story. Seniors nationwide tracked these proceedings closely, especially those beyond 50. Many recalled hardships. Ultimately, the judge scheduled another hearing to determine whether the charges should be fully dismissed. Although the final decision remained pending, one fact became clear: the investigative process had revealed inconsistencies too significant to ignore. A legal reckoning now seemed inevitable, setting the stage for a pivotal courtroom decision that could reshape local policing standards. The ramifications for the arresting officer, identified in official records as Sergeant Briggs, began unfolding immediately after the court proceedings highlighted glaring inconsistencies in his account. Excerpts from body cam footage contradicted his initial statements, and prior complaints surfaced, prompting the department to place him on administrative leave. Public trust faltered as local news outlets scrutinized his track record, exposing numerous questionable stops. Meanwhile, older residents who had advocated fair policing questioned the oversight mechanisms in place. Inside the department, discussions about potential disciplinary actions intensified. Supervisors examined Briggs's personnel file, finding troubling patterns in his traffic stop records. Although many citations seemed routine, multiple complaints registered by community members revealed an unsettling pattern of aggression during interactions with marginalized drivers. A thorough internal affairs review followed, with senior officers insisting on transparency. Their main objective was to protect departmental integrity while ensuring impartial consideration, free from external influence. While the official inquiry moved forward, local journalists uncovered details regarding Briggs's approach to policing. They interviewed residents of neighborhoods where he frequently patrolled, collecting statements alleging harsh treatment and unnecessary arrests. Calls for accountability escalated, with civic organizations demanding public disclosure of investigative findings. Weekly town hall meetings grew in attendance, reflecting the community's desire for change. Retirees, remembering historical injustices, voiced concern about the long-term impact. They urged local leaders to create open forums that encouraged frank discussions about civil rights. As scrutiny mounted, the district attorney's office announced its intention to re-examine prior cases involving Briggs. This broad review aimed to determine whether any convictions might have relied on unreliable testimony or questionable evidence. Simultaneously, local attorneys offered pro bono assistance to individuals who believed Briggs's actions had violated their rights. Some stories revealed nearly identical patterns, routine stops escalating suddenly, leading to questionable arrests. Amid growing pressure, the department pledged full cooperation. Eventually, in a bid to preserve community trust, high-ranking officials recommended that Briggs be temporarily relieved of his badge and service weapon. This interim measure allowed investigators access to his documents. Older citizens in the community, many of whom had experienced or witnessed prejudice in earlier decades, regarded these steps as overdue, although insufficient by themselves. They communicated their expectations clearly. Accountability required both formal disciplinary action and a lasting commitment to overhauling systemic flaws. As the review continued, Briggs faced increasing isolation from former allies within the force. Newspapers printed editorial columns calling for definitive consequences, and televised interviews highlighted potential ripple effects across neighboring counties. Though no verdict had been rendered, public opinion had shifted. Meanwhile, senior citizens who had watched the hearings with hope saw in these developments a chance for broader reforms. Only time would tell whether Briggs's downfall would spur meaningful change. Observing the unfolding legal proceedings, many community members recognized a broader pattern that extended well beyond a single officer's misconduct. The principle at stake involved the delicate balance between authority and responsibility, a dynamic that older Americans had long witnessed in various chapters of the nation's history. These citizens remembered instances when abuses of power had gone unchecked, and they saw parallels in the current case, reminding them of the importance of maintaining vigilance. At its core, this situation illustrated a sobering truth: power can corrupt if not restrained by meaningful oversight. In the realm of policing, the badge confers a duty to uphold the law, yet it also grants significant latitude. Without checks and balances, that latitude can morph into a tool for exploitation. Older individuals, who had lived through crucial social movements, perceived a renewed call for consistent ethical standards. Their voices carried weight at local gatherings, where they emphasized mutual respect, due process, and accountability as essential elements of effective governance. Within the courtroom, the detainees' experiences underscored how swiftly one's rights could be trampled if those entrusted with authority disregarded their obligations. Though this particular case gained traction due to visible evidence, it served as a reminder that many similar stories might never attract public attention. The deeply personal account resonated powerfully with audiences above 50 years old, recalling past decades when systemic inequities went unchallenged far too often. From tense city blocks to rural communities spanning countless miles, Americans had either endured or witnessed the ripple effects of injustice. Through that lens, they understood the tangible harm inflicted when the scales of justice tipped unfairly. Faced with these reflections, local leaders sought to underscore the importance of institutional reforms. Across the region, advocacy groups stressed the need for annual training, transparent complaint reviews, and open dialogues between law enforcement agencies and citizens. Civil organizations called on lawmakers to consider legislation mandating more rigorous screenings for officers, hoping to prevent future incidents of biased policing. For older residents, such steps revived memories of landmark advances that had come at great cost, prompting them to urge younger generations not to become complacent. In the midst of public discourse, another reality emerged: justice relies on collective courage. People cannot rely solely on official channels to correct every abuse. Instead, real progress often stems from a community's willingness to address uncomfortable truths. Senior citizens, especially, recognized that unity across diverse backgrounds was key to ensuring accountability. Their accumulated wisdom and historical perspective offered a guiding light for those grappling with questions about fairness and responsibility. Ultimately, the message remained unmistakable: safeguarding justice hinges on the moral resolve of ordinary citizens who refuse to accept silence when facing injustice.